A real husband provides. You are not even married yet, and you are already this selfish. Chloe's voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the kitchen I had spent 3 years saving to buy. I stood completely still, staring at the woman I was supposed to marry in exactly 3 weeks. Beside her stood her mother Brenda, holding her hand out with an expectant, entitled smirk. She was waiting for me to hand over my credit card. Not a standard debit card, but the unlimited corporate travel card I used strictly for major supply chain vendor emergencies at work. I had made the mistake of telling Chloe the limit on that card was essentially non-existent, meant to cover international shipping disasters. Now her mother wanted it for a last-minute wedding expense. I took a slow breath, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. I just need to know what the expense is, Brenda. We already paid the venue. The caterer is paid in full. The florist is locked in. What exactly requires a blank check 3 weeks before the wedding? Brenda sighed, dramatically adjusting her expensive silk scarf. She looked around my kitchen as if she was deeply inconvenienced by my presence in my own home. Honestly, Garrett, this is exactly what I warned Chloe about. It is just a few bridal necessities, last-minute upgrades. A mother knows what her daughter needs for her special day. You cannot expect me to pause my errands to call you for approval every time I swipe a card. We are family now. Or at least I thought we were. I am not asking you to call me for approval, I said, keeping my tone entirely level. I am asking for an invoice. If there is a legitimate wedding expense we missed, give me the bill. I will call the vendor right now and pay it directly over the phone. But I am not handing over an unlimited credit card for you to take to the mall. The mall, Brenda scoffed, placing a hand over her chest as if I had just insulted her ancestors. I am not going to the mall, Garrett. I am securing premium vendor upgrades to make sure this wedding does not look cheap. Your side of the family might be fine with a budget buffet, but my daughter has a standard to maintain. I am trying to save you from looking like a cheapskate in front of our guests. I felt a muscle twitch in my jaw. My side of the family consisted of a few hard-working cousins and aunts who had supported me after my father died. They did not care about premium upgrades. They cared about me. I had worked my way up from a warehouse floor manager to the director of supply chain for a major logistics firm. I worked 60-hour weeks to build my savings. I understood the value of $1 because I had to earn every single one of them. Chloe stepped forward, cutting off my thoughts. Her eyes were narrowed, cold, and entirely devoid of the affection I thought we shared. She did not look like a bride in love. She looked like a landlord demanding late rent. My ex-boyfriend never asked questions, Chloe snapped. The words hit the air like a physical blow. I stared at her, waiting for a punchline that never came. Excuse me, I asked, my voice dropping an octave. You heard me, Chloe said, crossing her arms. Preston gave me his black card for a weekend trip to Aspen and did not even look at the statement. He knew how to treat a woman. He knew that a real man does not interrogate his fiancée over a few $1,000s. You make a 6-figure salary directing a massive supply chain, and you are sweating over my mother doing some shopping to make my day perfect. It is embarrassing, Garrett. Preston, the ghost that haunted our entire relationship. Preston was a trust fund kid who had never worked a real job in his life. He drove a European sports car his father bought him and lived in a luxury condo his grandfather paid for. He had cheated on Chloe twice, which was why she left him, but apparently his financial abuse was perfectly acceptable because he funded her lifestyle without asking questions. I had spent 2 years trying to show her what a stable, respectful relationship looked like, but in the end I was just being measured against a bank account. I am not Preston, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I actually work for my money, and I am paying for 90% of this wedding by myself. Your mother has not contributed a single dime, so asking for a blank check is completely out of the question. Brenda stepped right up to the kitchen island, slamming her manicured hand onto the granite countertop. How dare you throw that in my face? A real man elevates his wife and her family. He does not nickel and dime the mother of the bride, especially a man who lives in a house he got for free. The silence that followed was absolute. This house was the only thing my father had left me when he passed away from a sudden heart attack 2 years ago. It was an outdated, beat-up property that I had poured my own blood, sweat, and savings into renovating. I spent weekends ripping up carpet, installing cabinets, and painting walls while grieving the only parent who had ever truly supported me. My father worked construction for 40 years just to pay off the mortgage on this place. Brenda knew that. Chloe knew that. And they were using it as a weapon to shame me into submission. I looked at Chloe. I waited for her to step in. I waited for the woman I loved to defend me, to defend my late father's memory, to tell her mother she had crossed a line. Instead, Chloe just held out her hand, her palm facing upward, mimicking her mother's entitled gesture. "Just give her the card." "Garrett." Chloe said, her voice dripping with exhaustion, as if I was a stubborn child throwing a tantrum. "Stop ruining this experience for me. If you really love me, you will prove it right now. Give her the card and let us get back to planning our future." I looked at the two of them standing in my kitchen. They were perfectly aligned, a united front of entitlement and manipulation. They thought they had me cornered. They thought my fear of losing the relationship, my fear of canceling a wedding 3 weeks out, would override my financial common sense and my self-respect. They assumed that because I had compromised on the expensive venue and the luxury catering, I would eventually cave on this. I reached into my back pocket. I felt the smooth leather of my wallet. Chloe's posture relaxed immediately. A smug, victorious smile spread across Brenda's face. They thought they had won. They thought I was exactly what they wanted me to be, an obedient wallet. I pulled the wallet out. I held it in my hand. I watched their eyes lock onto it with greedy anticipation. Then I snapped the leather wallet shut, slid it firmly back into my pocket, and looked Chloe dead in the eyes. No. The single word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Brenda's smug smile vanished. Chloe's jaw actually dropped. "No, Chloe," repeated, her voice shaking with sudden explosive rage. "You are saying no to my mother." "I am saying no to being treated like an ATM," I replied, holding my ground. "I am saying no to handing over unlimited access to my finances without a single shred of accountability. If you have an invoice, give it to me. Otherwise, the wedding budget is officially closed. Not another dollar gets spent without a receipt in my hand." Brenda let out a theatrical gasp, pressing her hand to her chest. "I have never been so insulted in my entire life. Chloe, are you going to let him speak to your mother this way? You are going to regret this." "Garrett," Chloe hissed, her face flushed red with anger. "You are proving exactly who you are. You are cheap, you are selfish, and you are nowhere near the man I thought you were." "Maybe I am not," I said, "but my answer is still no." I turned my back on them and walked out of the kitchen. I did not run, and I did not look back. I heard Brenda shouting something about respect, and I heard Chloe slam a cabinet door so hard I thought the glass would shatter. But I kept walking down the hallway until I reached my home office. I walked inside, shut the door, and locked it. I sat down at my desk, the desk my father had built for me when I got my first promotion. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from a massive surge of adrenaline and realization. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. The crack in our relationship had not just fractured, it had shattered into a gaping hole. This was not normal pre-wedding stress. This was not a minor disagreement about flowers or catering. This was a fundamental exposure of character. They did not see me as a partner. They saw me as a resource to be extracted, and the moment I set a boundary, they attacked my dignity, my career, and my dead father. I rubbed my temples, trying to calm the pounding in my head. I had protected my credit card today, but I knew with terrifying certainty that this was only the beginning. Chloe and Brenda were not the kind of women who accepted defeat gracefully. They were going to punish me for saying no. They were going to escalate this, and I had no idea how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. I just did not know that their next move was already in motion, and it was going to happen the very next evening in front of an entire audience. The silence in the car the next evening was so thick it felt like I was breathing underwater. After my refusal to hand over my corporate credit card, Chloe had not spoken a single word to me for 24 hours. Then at 5 o'clock sharp, she had sent a cold text message demanding I put on a suit and drive her to a family dinner at the Capitol Grill downtown. I knew it was a setup. I knew her mother Brenda would be there, armed with new passive-aggressive insults. But I went anyway. I went because a small, desperate part of me still hoped we could sit down like mature adults, talk through the wedding budget, and salvage the relationship I had invested 3 years of my life into. That hope died the second the hostess led us to a private booth in the back of the mahogany-paneled dining room. Brenda was not alone. Sitting next to her, swirling a glass of scotch that probably cost more than my first car, was Chloe's older brother, Trent. Trent was a day trader who wore tailored Italian suits and constantly checked the stock tickers on his phone. He drove a leased Porsche, lived in a luxury downtown loft, and spoke exclusively in financial buzzwords. He had always looked at me as if I were a pest that had wandered into his pristine world. Tonight he looked at me like I was the main course. "Well, look who finally decided to join the winning team," Trent sneered, not bothering to stand up or shake my hand as we reached the table. Chloe slid into the booth next to him, physically aligning herself with her family and leaving me to sit alone on the opposite side. It was a subtle gesture, but it screamed volumes. I was the outsider. I was the target. Brenda smiled at me. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator watching a trapped animal. "I am so glad you decided to come, Garrett," Brenda said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "After your little outburst yesterday, we thought it would be best to have a family discussion in a public place. You know where you cannot run and lock yourself in your office." I sat down slowly, unbuttoning my jacket. "I did not have an outburst, Brenda. I simply said no to giving you a blank check." Trent let out a loud, theatrical laugh. "A blank check. Listen to this guy. Mom asked for a few grand to make sure my sister does not look like she is marrying a substitute teacher, and you treat it like a corporate buyout. Relax, man. Money is meant to flow." The waiter appeared before I could respond. He handed out leather-bound menus, but Trent waved his away. "We do not need those," Trent told the waiter, leaning back with supreme arrogance. "We will start with the Grand Seafood Tower, 2 bottles of your best vintage Cabernet, and we are all doing the dry-aged ribeye, Oscar style. Oh, and keep the scotch coming for me." I did the math in my head instantly. The Seafood Tower alone was over $200. The wine he just casually ordered was easily $300 a bottle. Trent was orchestrating a feast that would push well past $1,000, and I knew exactly who he intended to hand the bill to. For the next hour, I sat in agonizing restraint while Trent and Brenda held court. They did not talk about the wedding ceremony. They did not talk about love or commitment. They talked exclusively about wealth status and the obligations of a modern husband. "You see," Garrett, Trent said, cutting a piece of his steak and pointing his silver fork directly at my chest. "The problem with guys like you is that you think small. You are a director of supply chain. What does that even mean? You move boxes from point A to point B. You are glorified warehouse staff." Chloe did not defend me. She took a slow sip of her red wine and looked away, completely detached. "I manage international logistics for a Fortune 500 company," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the heat rising in my neck. "I manage a team of 50 people and a budget of $80 million. Trent rolled his eyes, taking a heavy gulp of his scotch. "A budget you do not own, bro. You are an employee. You punch a clock. And that employee mindset is exactly why you are sweating a few grand for my mother. A real man, a provider, elevates his wife and her family. He does not count pennies. He creates a lifestyle. Look at Preston." There it was again. Preston, the trust fund ex-boyfriend. When Chloe was with Preston. Trent continued leaning across the table to invade my space. They flew private to Cabo for my birthday. Preston understood how the game is played. You marry into this family, you step up. You do not disrespect my mother by asking for receipts like a mid-level accountant. Brenda wiped her mouth gently with a linen napkin. "We just want Chloe to be taken care of, Garrett. We want to know she is marrying a man who can provide the standard of living she was raised with. Refusing to help with a simple wedding upgrade makes us worry. It makes us think you are hiding financial problems." I looked at the 3 of them. They were a synchronized machine of manipulation. They were trying to publicly shame me, breaking down my self-esteem so I would eagerly open my wallet just to earn their fleeting approval. They thought my pride as a man was tied to my ability to throw money away on demand. They had no idea that my pride was tied to my self-respect. I did not argue with Trent. I did not raise my voice at Brenda. I just ate my steak in silence, letting them talk. The prime beef tasted like ash in my mouth, but I chewed slowly, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose my appetite. My silence seemed to infuriate them even more. Trent grew louder, his insults becoming more personal, attacking my clothes, my car, and the house I had inherited from my father. He called my home a blue-collar dump. He called my career a dead end. I absorbed every single word, filing it away, building a wall of pure cold resolve. Finally, the plates were cleared. The waiter approached the table carrying a black leather folder. The moment of truth had arrived. The entire dinner had been a carefully constructed trap leading to this exact second. Trent did not even look at the waiter. He just waved his hand dismissively toward my side of the table. "Give that to the groom-to-be," Trent announced loudly, ensuring the tables next to us could hear. "He is a real provider. He is taking care of the family tonight." The waiter placed the black folder directly in front of me. Chloe finally looked at me, a smug, expectant expression on her face. This was her test. She wanted to see if her brother had bullied me into submission. She wanted to see if I would buy my way back into her good graces. I opened the folder. The total was $1,247. I looked at Trent, who was smirking over the rim of his Scotch glass. Then I looked at Brenda, who had her arms crossed, waiting for me to pull out my credit card. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened my calculator app. I looked at the itemized receipt. I found the ribeye I had ordered. I found the salad Chloe had eaten and the single glass of wine she drank. I added the tax. I calculated a generous 20% tip for the waiter because he had done an excellent job dealing with Trent. The total for Chloe and me came to exactly $218. I reached into my wallet, pulled out $300 bills, and laid them neatly on top of the receipt. I closed the black folder and pushed it across the table toward Trent. "What is that?" Trent asked, his smirk faltering slightly as he stared at the leather folder. "That is my half," I said calmly. "I covered Chloe and myself, plus the tip. The rest is yours." Trent stared at me as if I had just spoken a foreign language. "Are you joking right now? You are making me pay for my own dinner. You ordered a seafood tower, 2 bottles of vintage wine, and 4 glasses of expensive scotch," I replied, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet restaurant. "You are a successful day trader who understands how money flows. Surely you can handle your own tab." Brenda slammed her hand on the table, her face flushing a deep, furious red. "Garrett, you cannot be serious. This was a family dinner. You are humiliating us in front of the entire restaurant." "I am not humiliating anyone," I said, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. "You invited me out to ambush me, insult my career, and mock my late father's house. You expected me to pay over $1,000 for the privilege of being treated like a peasant. I do not play those games, Brenda." Chloe grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve. Her eyes were wide with genuine panic. "Garrett, stop it. Pay the bill. Do not do this to my brother." I looked down at her hand and then directly into her eyes. "If your brother wants to live like Preston, he can pay like Preston." I pulled my arm away from her grasp. I turned my back on them and walked away. I did not run, and I did not look back. I could hear Trent cursing loudly behind me, complaining to the waiter that he did not have his primary card on him. I heard Brenda hissing my name, calling me a cheap, pathetic loser. The words bounced right off me. I walked out of the heavy glass doors of the steakhouse and into the cool evening air. The valet looked at me expectantly, but I just handed him my ticket in silence. I waited on the curb, listening to the hum of the city traffic, feeling the cool breeze against my flushed face. My heart was pounding, but it was not from fear. It was from the absolute clarity of what had just happened. They had laid their trap perfectly. They had used every tactic in the book to manipulate my ego and drain my accounts. But they had failed. I walked to my car, got in, and gripped the steering wheel tightly. The crack in the relationship was no longer just a hole. It was a completely shattered mirror. I knew Chloe would come home furious. I knew the wedding was in serious jeopardy. What I did not know was that the dinner was only a distraction. While I was focused on defending my pride at the steakhouse, Chloe and Brenda had already set their real plan in motion. I was about to discover exactly how dangerous they truly were. The drive back from the steakhouse was the quietest 30 minutes of my life. I did not turn on the radio. I did not roll down the windows. I just listened to the steady hum of the tires against the cold pavement and let the brutal reality of the evening wash over me. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house was completely dark. Chloe's car was gone. She had undoubtedly gone out drinking with Trent and Brenda, likely sitting in some upscale cocktail lounge right now, complaining about what a terrible, selfish partner I was. The silence inside was heavy thick with the tension of a relationship that was rapidly unspooling. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water, staring blankly at the granite countertops we had picked out together just 6 months ago. Everything in this house, from the hardwood floors to the paint on the walls, had been built for a future I was suddenly entirely unsure of. I needed a distraction. I needed to answer some work emails, review a supply chain manifest, or look at logistics spreadsheets just to get my mind off the disastrous family dinner and the cruel words Trent had thrown in my face. My work laptop was upstairs in my office, but the shared home iPad was sitting right there on the kitchen island, plugged into the charger. The screen woke up instantly, brightly illuminating the dark kitchen. Chloe had not locked it before she stormed out earlier that afternoon to meet her brother. She was always careless with her devices, leaving tabs open and apps running, assuming I would never look. The tablet was open directly to her iCloud Notes application. I actually moved my index finger toward the home button to close the application, but my eyes caught the bold text at the very top of the open document. The title was typed in all capital letters: Wedding and Mom's Upgrades. My thumb hovered over the screen and froze completely. Brenda had just demanded my corporate credit card for last-minute bridal necessities. Trent had publicly mocked me for sweating a few grand for his mother. I told myself it was wrong to read her private notes, but the rational, protective part of my brain screamed that I had every right to know exactly what they were planning to buy with my hard-earned money. I lowered the glass of water to the counter. My pulse started to quicken as I scrolled down. The first few lines were standard wedding items that we had already discussed, though the numbers next to them were inflated beyond our agreed budget. Upgraded floral arrangements for the reception hall for $5,000. A professional string quartet for the cocktail hour for $2,000. Premium vintage champagne for the head table. A private videography package that cost more than my first car. But as I kept scrolling past the wedding day details, the items changed drastically. The tone of the note shifted from innocent bridal planning to something dark, calculated, and methodical. This was no longer a list for catering or flowers. It was a comprehensive financial blueprint, and the sheer scale of what I was reading made the blood run completely cold in my veins. Under a bold heading labeled Post-Wedding Timeline, Chloe had written out a detailed step-by-step strategy for the months following our marriage. Step 1 was titled, Secure the Luxury Condominium for Mom. Beneath that heading, Chloe had outlined the exact neighborhood Brenda wanted to live in, specifying a building that required a massive down payment. But next to the down payment figure in neat parentheses, Chloe had typed the words that made my stomach drop. Use Garrett's flawless credit score to sign the mortgage loan. Transfer the deed into Mom's name completely after 1 year. Brenda was not just looking for a new dress. They were planning to use my excellent credit history to buy her a permanent luxury residence, legally tying me to hundreds of thousands of dollars in property debt. They knew Brenda could never qualify on her own, so they were going to use my financial stability as their personal Trojan horse. I felt a wave of physical nausea hit my stomach, but I could not stop reading. I forced my eyes to the next bullet point. Step 2 involved Trent. It read, Lease agreement for Portia McCann. Use Garrett's corporate proof of income to bypass the strict debt-to-income ratio check. Trent, the arrogant day trader who had just spent an entire hour calling me a glorified warehouse worker and mocking my blue-collar roots, was entirely unqualified to lease the luxury sports car he desperately wanted to flaunt. His flashy lifestyle was a complete illusion. He did not have the verifiable income to pass a dealership credit check, so they were going to forge my pay stubs and leverage my salary to secure the vehicle under my name. If Trent missed a single payment, the dealership would come directly after me, destroying the credit I had meticulously built. But the final item on the list was the one that completely shattered my reality and broke my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. Step 3 was highlighted with a bright yellow digital marker. The words were written with terrifying cold clarity. Quietly wipe out the Capital One and Chase credit card balances before the marriage license is officially signed. Need exactly $45,000. We'll transfer the funds directly from Garrett's joint savings account the morning of the wedding while he is getting ready with his groomsmen. Do not let him see the bank statements until after we get back from the honeymoon in Greece. I read that paragraph 5 times. $45,000 of hidden toxic debt. Chloe had always told me she had absolutely zero debt. She bragged about being financially responsible, judging her friends who carried balances on their cards. She had secretly racked up a massive mountain of high-interest credit card debt, spending recklessly on designer clothes, expensive dinners, and luxury vacations. Her master plan was to drain the emergency savings account I had spent 3 grueling years building. That money was supposed to be our safety net, the funds we would use to start a family or handle a crisis. She was going to erase her mistakes using my sweat and sacrifice before we were legally bound by the state, leaving me completely wiped out. I slowly set the iPad down on the granite counter. My hands were completely numb, my fingers tingling with a mixture of shock and pure adrenaline. I walked out of the kitchen, stepped into the living room, and sat heavily on the edge of the sofa. I stared at the blank television screen mounted on the wall. I saw the last 3 years of my life playing backward, every conversation, every argument, every demand suddenly cast in a harsh, unforgiving light. I was not a fiancé to Chloe. I was not an equal partner, and I certainly was not a man she truly loved or respected. I was a wallet. I was an unlimited line of credit. I was a financial host for a family of parasites who had coldly calculated exactly how much blood they could extract from me before I noticed I was dying. The dinner at the steakhouse made perfect sense now. It had not just been an ambush to humiliate me, it had been a psychological test. They wanted to break my confidence. They wanted to make me feel so small, so inadequate, and so desperate for their validation that I would blindly sign whatever documents they put in front of me just to earn their fleeting approval. They needed me compliant, beaten down, and desperate to please, because their entire financial heist depended entirely on my blind obedience. The betrayal burned through my chest like battery acid, rapidly replacing the deep sadness with a cold, focused, and absolute clarity. My grief evaporated, leaving behind a hard, unbreakable shell of resolve. They thought I was a pathetic pushover who would roll over and let them drain my life savings without putting up a fight. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot what I actually do for a living every single day. My entire career is built on tracking valuable resources, identifying hidden liabilities, auditing fraudulent behavior, and ruthlessly cutting off bad vendors who try to exploit the system. Chloe, Brenda, and Trent were the absolute worst liabilities I had ever encountered, and I was about to cut them off permanently. I stood up from the sofa, leaving the dark living room behind, and walked back into the kitchen to begin systematically dismantling the future they expected me to pay for. The heavy silence of the living room felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I left the iPad sitting on the kitchen counter, its glowing screen casting a pale light across the granite. But the words typed in that digital note were already burned permanently into my brain. $45,000 of hidden debt. A luxury condominium down payment. A leased sports car for a brother who despised me. This was not a wedding. This was a calculated financial execution, and I was the mark. I stood there in the dark, listening to the steady ticking of the wall clock, feeling a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. My heart hammered against my ribs with a violent, erratic rhythm. The woman I had promised to marry, the woman I had shared a bed with and built a future around, had been systematically studying my financial habits, not out of love, but out of predatory preparation. She knew my credit score was flawless. She knew I had spent the last decade religiously paying off every balance, avoiding unnecessary loans, and building a financial fortress. And she intended to burn that fortress to the ground the moment the ink dried on our marriage license. Panic raw and suffocating clawed at my throat. I needed to know how far this had already gone. I needed to know if the digital shopping list on that tablet was just a delusional fantasy or an active operation. I turned my back on the dark kitchen and took the stairs 2 at a time, sprinting toward my home office. I threw open the door and practically collapsed into the leather chair behind my desk. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely open the lid of my laptop. The screen flared to life, illuminating my desperate pale reflection in the glass. I opened the web browser and navigated straight to my primary credit monitoring service. My fingers slipped on the keys twice as I typed in my password. The system prompted me for a 2-factor authentication code. I grabbed my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen, waiting for the text message to arrive. The 10 seconds it took for that 6-digit code to come through felt like an absolute eternity. I typed the numbers into the browser, hit enter, and watched the loading circle spin. The dashboard loaded, displaying my credit score in a large green circle. It was still excellent. For one fleeting, desperate second, I let out a breath, thinking maybe I had caught her before she could actually execute her plan. Maybe the note was just a wish list she and her mother had put together while drinking wine. But then my eyes dropped to the section labeled Recent Activity. The green circle might have been intact, but right below it, flagged with a bright red warning icon, was a notification that made my stomach completely drop. 3 new hard credit inquiries had been posted to my file within the last 48 hours. 3 hard inquiries. My vision blurred for a moment as I clicked on the alert to expand the details. The first inquiry was from a high-end mortgage lending firm located in downtown Chicago. The exact firm Brenda had mentioned a few weeks ago when she was bragging about the real estate market. They had run a full comprehensive background and credit check under my name for a pre-approval on a luxury condo mortgage. The second inquiry was from a regional auto finance corporation, specifically the financing arm that handled leases for imported sports cars like the Porsche Macan Trent, so desperately wanted. The third inquiry was the most aggressive. It was a direct application for a high-yield personal loan of exactly $45,000 from a major national bank. They were not waiting for the wedding. They had already started pulling the triggers. I sat frozen in my office chair, staring at the screen as a wave of pure nausea washed over me. How did she do this? How did she authorize these credit pulls without my physical signature or my consent? The answer hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. My social security number. 2 years ago, when we were applying for an upgraded rental apartment before I bought this house, I had asked Chloe to fill out the paperwork while I was driving. I had recited my 9-digit social security number to her out loud. She had always boasted about having a photographic memory for numbers. She remembered birthdays, anniversaries, and phone numbers with terrifying accuracy. She had memorized my social security number, filed it away in her mind, and weaponized it the moment she and her mother decided it was time to cash out. She was committing outright identity theft, using the trust of our relationship as her cover story. The betrayal was so deep, so absolute, that it bypassed anger and went straight into a cold, paralyzing shock. I felt a sudden violent urge to grab the iPad, march out the front door, drive directly to the downtown bar where she was drinking with Trent, and throw the evidence right in her face. I wanted to scream at her in front of everyone. I wanted to call the police and report her for financial fraud. I wanted to watch her perfect, smug expression shatter into a million pieces. But as quickly as the urge flared up, my professional instincts kicked in and smothered it completely. I am a supply chain director. My entire career is based on anticipating disasters, managing rogue variables and neutralizing threats before they can destroy the final delivery. If I confronted Chloe now, I would be handing over my only advantage. I would be giving up the element of surprise. I knew exactly how she would react if I walked into that bar screaming. She would instantly play the victim. She would start crying tears of fake trauma. She would tell the entire family, her friends, and the police that I was an abusive, paranoid control freak who was hacking into her private devices. She would spin a web of lies so thick that I would look like the villain, and worse, she would immediately contact those lenders to figure out another way to secure the money before I could shut the accounts down. Confrontation was a loser's game. Gaslighting was her primary weapon, and I was not going to give her the opportunity to use it. Instead of blowing up, I decided to play a completely different game, a quiet, ruthless game of total demolition. I leaned closer to the laptop screen, my shaking hands finally becoming steady. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I opened 3 separate tabs on my browser, one for Equifax, one for Experian, and one for TransUnion. I navigated to the security center of each bureau and initiated a total unconditional credit freeze on my profile. I set up complex randomized PIN codes for each bureau, writing them down on a piece of paper that I folded and shoved deep into my pocket. Within 15 minutes, my credit file was locked behind an impenetrable digital wall. Any further attempts by Chloe, Brenda, or Trent to open a loan, secure a mortgage, or lease a vehicle would be instantly rejected. But I did not stop there. I opened another tab and logged into my primary banking portal. I had a joint checking account with Chloe meant specifically for wedding expenses, but the vast majority of my money, the savings I had bled for over the last 3 years, was sitting in a personal account that only I had the credentials for. Or so I thought. After reading her note about transferring the $45,000 on the morning of the wedding, I realized she must have secretly recorded my banking passwords, perhaps watching my fingers type them into my phone. I immediately opened a new secure account with a completely different banking institution online. I initiated an electronic wire transfer, draining every single dollar from my vulnerable savings account and moving it into the new vault. I left exactly $100 in the old account just to keep it open and avoid arousing immediate suspicion. Then I systematically went through every single digital footprint I owned. I changed the password to my email, my banking apps, my investment portfolios, and my cloud storage. I enabled biometric authentication for everything. I was no longer a fiancé preparing for a wedding. I was a corporate auditor severing ties with a fraudulent vendor, and I was cutting off their supply lines one by one. When I was finally finished, I closed the laptop. The room was quiet again, but the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt like the calm before a massive, calculated storm. I sat in the dark for a few minutes, breathing deeply, letting the reality of my new life settle into my bones. The wedding was dead. The relationship was a corpse. The only thing left to do was arrange the funeral, and I was going to make sure the entire family attended. Suddenly, the low hum of the automatic garage door opening echoed up through the floorboards. Chloe was home. I heard the engine of her car shut off, followed by the familiar click of her heels against the concrete floor of the garage. I heard the door to the kitchen open and shut. Garrett, her voice echoed up the stairs, carrying a forced sing-song tone that made my skin crawl. "Are you home? Are you still pouting in your office?" I stood up from my desk. I smoothed down the front of my shirt. I looked at myself in the reflection of the dark window pane. I needed to act as though I had seen nothing. I needed to play the role of the defeated, obedient partner who was slowly accepting his place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. They needed to believe they were winning so they would blindly walk right into the trap I was building. I walked out of the office and started down the stairs. Chloe was standing in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water, looking annoyed that she had to acknowledge my presence. She glanced up at me, her eyes cold and assessing, waiting for me to apologize for walking out of the steakhouse. I forced the corners of my mouth to lift. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman who was trying to steal my identity and bankrupt my future, and I gave her the most convincing, apologetic smile I had ever mustered in my entire life. "Hey," I said, my voice completely smooth and perfectly calm. "I am sorry about earlier. Everything is fine." Her posture relaxed, a smug look of absolute triumph settling over her face. She thought she had broken me. She had absolutely no idea that I had just locked the doors to the vault and she was already standing outside in the freezing cold. I woke up the next morning feeling like a completely different person. The panic that had gripped my chest the night before was gone, replaced by a cold and calculated focus. When Chloe walked into the kitchen, she was already dressed in a sharp blazer and designer heels, looking at me with that same expectant, entitled expression she had worn at the steakhouse. I forced a warm smile and poured her a cup of coffee. She took it without saying thank you. She told me we had an appointment at noon with a family friend named Robert Sterling. She claimed he was an estate planner who just wanted to give us a wedding gift by offering some free financial advice. I knew immediately it was a trap. People like Chloe and her mother do not do anything for free, and they certainly do not introduce family friends without an ulterior motive. But I played along. I nodded, told her it sounded like a great idea, and went upstairs to put on a suit. The drive downtown was suffocating. Chloe spent the entire 30 minutes scrolling through her phone, occasionally sighing loudly to remind me that she was still irritated with my behavior from the previous 2 days. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, completely aware that my credit was currently locked down tight behind a digital wall. She had no idea that her grand plan to drain my savings was already dead in the water. We pulled up to a sleek, modern high-rise building in the financial district. We rode the elevator up to the 34th floor in total silence. When the doors opened, we stepped into a reception area that screamed expensive legal fees. The mahogany walls, the marble floors, the sweeping view of the city skyline. This was not a casual meeting with a family friend. A receptionist in a tailored dress greeted Chloe by name and led us down a long corridor into a massive corner office. Sitting behind a sprawling glass desk was Robert Sterling. He was an older man with silver hair wearing a pinstripe suit that probably cost more than my first car. He stood up and shook my hand, his grip overly firm, his smile practiced and hollow. He gestured for us to sit in the plush leather chairs across from his desk. Chloe immediately reached out and grabbed my hand, interlocking her fingers with mine. It was the first time she had touched me affectionately in days, and it made my skin crawl. She looked at Sterling with wide, innocent eyes, playing the role of the devoted bride to absolute perfection. Sterling folded his hands together on top of his desk and leaned forward. He bypassed all the pleasantries and got straight to the point. He told me that entering a marriage is a beautiful thing, but it is also a legal partnership that requires absolute transparency and protection. I watched him slide a thick bound document across the glass desk toward me. He called it a standard prenuptial agreement, drafted simply to ensure that everyone was on the same page before the big day. I stared at the stack of papers, feeling a cold wave of realization wash over me. The ambush was finally springing its jaws. I reached out and pulled the document toward me. The cover page bore the logo of Sterling and his high-end law firm. I did not rush. I took my time opening the folder, acutely aware of Chloe watching my every move. She shifted in her leather chair, her leg bouncing slightly with nervous energy. Sterling began speaking in a smooth, practiced cadence, explaining that this was entirely routine and meant to protect both of our futures. I tuned his voice out completely and focused on the black ink printed on the thick paper. As a supply chain director, I spend my days analyzing complex vendor contracts, identifying loopholes, and spotting predatory clauses. Reading a legal document was second nature to me. It only took me 2 pages to realize that this was not a standard prenuptial agreement. It was a financial death warrant. I flipped to the section detailing premarital assets and liabilities. The words jumped off the page, confirming everything I had discovered on the iPad the night before. Clause 4 explicitly stated that upon the signing of the marriage license, I would legally assume full responsibility for all of Chloe and her existing premarital debt. The document did not list a specific dollar amount, which was a brilliant and terrifying legal maneuver. It meant that the $45,000 of hidden credit card debt she had racked up would instantly become my legal burden, tied directly to my name and my credit history. If we ever divorced, she would walk away completely debt-free while I would be left holding the bag for her reckless spending. But that was not even the worst part. I turned to page 7, where a section regarding real estate had been heavily highlighted. I read the paragraph 3 times to make sure I was actually understanding the sheer audacity of what they had drafted. The clause centered on the home I had inherited from my late father, the home I had poured my blood, sweat, and savings into renovating. According to the contract, in the event of a divorce or separation, I would be legally required to vacate the premises. The property would remain in my name, meaning I would still be responsible for the property taxes and the maintenance costs, but the exclusive right of occupancy would be granted to Chloe and her mother, Brenda. They had written a provision stating that Brenda would be permitted to live in my father and his house rent-free indefinitely, citing emotional distress and lifestyle maintenance. They were not just trying to steal my savings. They were trying to steal my home, my sanctuary, and the only piece of my father I had left. They had structured a contract where they literally could not lose. If the marriage lasted, they had unrestricted access to my income, my credit, and my resources to fund their luxury lifestyle. If the marriage failed, they got to evict me from my own property and live rent-free while I paid off the massive debts they had secretly accumulated. It was the most predatory, disgusting piece of legal fiction I had ever seen in my life. I kept my face entirely blank, refusing to give Sterling or Chloe the satisfaction of seeing my shock. I slowly closed the folder and looked up at the lawyer. I asked him if he had drafted this document himself. He smiled, leaning back in his expensive chair, and nodded. He told me it was a collaborative effort between him and Brenda to ensure that Chloe felt secure stepping into this new chapter of her life. He used words like security, trust, and family values, weaponizing them to make the theft seem noble. I looked over at Chloe. Her eyes were wide and she was biting her lower lip, trying to look vulnerable. She had known about this every single step of the way. She had sat at my kitchen table, eaten the food I bought, slept in the bed I paid for, all while planning to completely destroy my life. I rested my hands flat on top of the closed folder. I looked directly at Chloe and asked her why we were doing this 3 weeks before the wedding. I kept my voice soft, playing the role of a confused and hurt partner. I asked her why she felt she needed a contract to protect herself from me when I had done nothing but support her for the last 3 years. That was all it took for the performance to begin. Chloe let out a perfectly timed, shaky breath. Tears immediately welled up in her eyes, spilling over her lashes and running down her cheeks. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She reached out and grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my suit jacket. She told me that I was breaking her heart by questioning this. Her voice trembled as she said that her mother was just trying to look out for her, that Brenda had seen too many women left with nothing after giving their best years to a man. She looked at me with those tear-filled eyes and asked how I could be so cold. "If you really love me, you will sign it to protect my mom," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking with fake sorrow. "Do you not want to be a real man? Do you not want to prove to my family that you are actually committed to us?" The words echoed in the quiet office. A real man. It was the exact same toxic rhetoric Trent and Brenda had used at the steakhouse. They were trying to back me into a corner where my only options were to sign away my entire financial future or admit that I was a coward who did not truly love her. Sterling sat quietly behind his desk, letting Chloe do the heavy lifting. He was a professional predator, and he knew that emotional pressure from a crying bride was infinitely more effective than legal jargon. He just watched me, waiting for my resolve to crack, waiting for me to pull a pen from my pocket and sign my life away just to make the tears stop. I felt a sudden vibration in my pocket. My phone was buzzing. I ignored it at first, but it buzzed again, and then a third time. Chloe was still crying, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue Sterling had handed her, begging me to just trust her and sign the document so we could move forward and be happy. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen. There were 3 new text messages from Trent. He must have known exactly what time this meeting was scheduled. I was probably sitting in his luxury loft right now, sipping expensive scotch, waiting for the confirmation that his new leased Porsche was finally secured. I opened the messages. The first one read, "Do not embarrass my sister today." The second one read, "A real provider signs the paper." The third message was a single insulting sentence that made the blood freeze in my veins. "Sign the paper, box boy." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. Box boy. That was what he thought of me. That was what this entire family thought of me. I was just a blue-collar worker who moved boxes for a living, a peasant who was lucky enough to be invited into their superior world, and my only purpose was to finance their delusions of grandeur. They thought they had broken my spirit at the steakhouse. They thought the combination of a high-powered lawyer, a complicated legal document, and a crying fiancé would be enough to overwhelm my senses and force me into submission. They honestly believed I was that stupid. I put the phone back into my pocket. The anger inside me was a towering inferno, but I did not let a single spark show on my face. I looked at the tears rolling down Chloe and her cheeks. I looked at Sterling waiting with a silver pen resting on his desk. I looked at the predatory contract that was designed to rip my father and his house away from me and saddle me with crushing debt. I knew that if I refused to sign it right now, they would panic. They would cancel the wedding themselves, blame me for everything, and spin a narrative that I was an abusive, controlling monster. I would never get the chance to expose them for what they truly were. I needed them to believe they had won. I needed them to feel so secure, so absolutely victorious that they would blindly walk right to the edge of the cliff. So I took a deep breath, let my shoulders slump in defeat, and prepared to give the greatest performance of my life. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone resting heavily in my lap. The words from Trent burned into my vision. "Sign the paper box, boy." The sheer disrespect was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. He thought he had me cornered in this high-rise office with a predatory lawyer and a crying fiancée. My first instinct was to stand up, tear this disgusting legal document into pieces and throw it directly in Robert Sterling and his smug face. I wanted to scream at Chloe. I wanted to call her a fraud. I wanted to walk out of that mahogany double door and leave them sitting there in stunned silence. But as a supply chain director, my career is built on calculating outcomes and mitigating catastrophic losses. I realized in that split second that if I exploded right now, I would win a temporary battle but completely lose the war. If I refused flat out and walked away, Chloe would cancel the wedding herself. She would sprint to our entire network of friends and family, spinning a tragic narrative where I was an abusive, financially controlling monster who abandoned her. She would play the devastated victim to absolute perfection. Brenda would back her up, calling every relative to tell them how they narrowly escaped a toxic marriage. Trent would spread the lies at his country club. Worst of all, they would escape without ever facing any real consequences for their massive hidden debts or their calculated financial fraud. They would just move on to their next victim. I needed a different strategy. I needed them to drop their guard completely so I could expose them in front of the very people they were trying to impress. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the righteous anger wash out of my face, carefully replacing it with a mask of complete defeat. I let my shoulders slump forward, collapsing my posture. I looked down at the marble floor, breaking eye contact with Sterling, projecting the exhausted body language of a broken man who had finally realized he was outmatched. I let out a long, heavy sigh. When I finally looked back up at Chloe, I forced a look of deep regret into my eyes. She was still dabbing at her face with a white tissue, holding her breath, waiting for my surrender. I reached across the heavy glass desk and gently pulled the thick legal document back toward me, resting my hands flat against its cover. I did not push the paper away in anger. I held it slowly as if the document was heavy with my own guilt. I looked directly into Chloe and her tear-filled eyes, ignoring the cold calculation hiding just behind her pupils. "You are right," I said, keeping my voice soft and slightly unsteady. "I am being selfish." I let those words hang in the quiet office. The silence was thick. Sterling leaned back in his plush leather chair, a highly satisfied smirk forming on his wrinkled face. He folded his hands across his stomach, the picture of a successful predator closing a trap. Chloe lowered the tissue slowly, her eyes widening slightly as the realization washed over her. She had won. I have been so focused on budgets and spreadsheets that I completely lost sight of what really matters. I continued swallowing every ounce of my pride to make the performance believable. I want your mother to feel secure in her older years. I want you to feel protected and cherished. I am sorry it took me sitting here to finally understand that. I looked at Sterling, who was already reaching across his desk to offer me a silver fountain pen, fully expecting me to sign right then and there. But I held up my hand just slightly. "I am going to sign it," I said, making sure my tone was apologetic and eager to please. "But I need my own lawyer to look it over first, just to make sure the legal language is standard. It will only take a few days." Sterling frowned slightly, a brief flash of irritation crossing his face. But before he could argue, I turned back to Chloe and delivered the ultimate bait. I will sign it at the rehearsal dinner, I promised, infusing my voice with a desperate need for her approval. I will sign it in front of both our families to prove my commitment to you. I want to show everyone, especially your mother and your brother, that I am ready to step up and be a real husband. The transformation in Chloe was instantaneous and terrifying to witness. The fake tears vanished completely, drying up in the span of a single second. The trembling vulnerability evaporated, replaced by a radiant, triumphant, and predatory smile. She reached across the desk and grabbed my hand tightly, her manicured nails digging into my skin. "Oh, Garrett," she practically cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I knew you would understand. I knew you were the good man I fell in love with. Thank you for protecting us." Sterling closed his folder and nodded approvingly. "Having your counsel review the document is a very responsible decision, Garrett," he said smoothly. "It shows you are taking this partnership seriously. We will have the final copies printed and bound in a premium leather folder for the rehearsal dinner. It will be a wonderful moment for your families to share." He had absolutely no idea that I did not have a family lawyer, and I had zero intention of ever letting a pen touch that poisonous paper. The trap was perfectly set, and they had walked right into it, locking the door behind themselves. The car ride home was entirely different from the suffocating trip downtown. The tension that had choked the air earlier was gone, replaced by Chloe and her manic energy. She turned up the radio, humming along to pop songs, completely oblivious to the Cold War I was waging behind the steering wheel. She talked endlessly about the floral arrangements and the cocktail hour menu. She reached over and patted my leg affectionately, treating me exactly like a well-trained dog that had finally learned to obey its master after a harsh beating. She could not even wait until we got home to share the news. She called her mother the second we pulled into our driveway. I sat in the driver's seat listening to her excitedly tell Brenda that everything was handled. "He is going to sign it." "Mom," Chloe said, her voice bright and loud. "He is going to do it at the rehearsal dinner in front of everyone." I could hear Brenda letting out a shrill cheer through the phone speaker, followed by a self-righteous speech about how men just need to be trained properly. They honestly believed they had completely broken my spine. Over the next 3 days, their arrogance reached a level of pure insanity. Because they believed my excellent credit and my savings were about to become their personal piggy bank. They threw all financial caution to the wind. Chloe started receiving daily deliveries from high-end luxury boutiques, huge designer boxes piled up in our hallway. She casually told me she was finalizing her bridal wardrobe, but I knew the truth. She was putting everything on her maxed-out credit cards, assuming my money would wipe the enormous balances clean by the end of the week. Brenda showed up at my house uninvited on a Tuesday afternoon, walking right through the front door like she already owned the place. I found her in the living room with a yellow metal measuring tape, discussing with Chloe which load-bearing walls she planned to knock down once she moved in. She talked loudly about hiring a premium contractor to gut the kitchen, ignoring the fact that I had just spent 2 years renovating it myself. She looked at me and told me I should start packing up my father and his old junk in the garage to make room for her luxury SUV. Trent was not going to be left out of the spending spree. He texted me a glossy brochure picture of the exact silver Porsche Macan he was planning to lease. The text read, "Make sure your corporate income statements are printed and ready for the dealership on Monday morning, box boy." They were completely unhinged. I watched them dig their financial graves deeper with every passing hour, racking up debts and making promises they could never keep without my signature. I smiled through all of it. I nodded politely when Brenda insulted my home. I offered to carry Chloe and her heavy shopping bags upstairs. I replied to Trent and his text with a simple thumbs-up emoji. I played the role of the defeated ATM to absolute perfection. I became invisible to them, just a piece of furniture that occasionally dispensed cash. They were so blinded by their own greed and their overwhelming sense of superiority that they never once stopped to look closely at me or question my sudden change of heart. If they had bothered to pay attention, they would have noticed that my travel bags were already packed and hidden deep in the trunk of my car. They would have noticed that my valuable possessions, my important documents, and my emergency cash were slowly disappearing from the house, moved quietly into a secure storage unit while Chloe was out drinking with her friends. They thought they were preparing for a lavish wedding and a lifetime of free money, but they were entirely wrong. I was preparing for a total demolition, and the countdown had officially begun. The morning sun filtered through the tall bay windows of the kitchen, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Chloe stood by the massive marble island, dressed in a tailored cream blazer and expensive designer jeans. She held a cup of artisan coffee I had brewed for her earlier. Her mother Brenda was scheduled to pick her up in exactly 20 minutes. They were going to an exclusive bridal boutique in the financial district to finalize the fitting for a custom gown that cost more than the first car I ever purchased. Chloe was radiating a manic and entitled energy. She truly believed she had completely conquered my spirit in that mahogany law office 3 days ago. She believed my silence and my forced compliance meant I had finally accepted my permanent role as her personal bank account. She looked at me over the rim of her ceramic coffee mug with a smug and deeply satisfied expression. She told me to make sure the dry cleaning was picked up by noon. She told me to call our travel agent and upgrade our honeymoon flights to first class because Brenda suggested she deserved to travel in absolute luxury. I nodded politely at her demands. I gave her a warm and completely agreeable smile. I told her I would handle every single item on her list. I watched her walk into the hallway and check her reflection in the full-length mirror. She adjusted the heavy diamond engagement ring on her finger, ensuring it caught the morning light perfectly. Then she grabbed her imported leather purse and walked out the front door without saying goodbye. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind her, locking perfectly into place. The house fell into absolute silence. The daily performance was finally over. I let my agreeable smile drop completely from my face. My features settled into a cold and hardened line of pure resolve. I walked up the hardwood stairs to my home office. I sat down at my heavy oak desk and pulled a massive leather-bound binder from the bottom drawer. It was the master wedding planner. Chloe had spent the last 9 months filling it with color-coded tabs and glossy magazine clippings and expensive vendor brochures. To her, this heavy binder represented a magical fairy tale. To me, it was a massive ledger of toxic financial liabilities. As a director of supply chain management, my entire professional life revolves around identifying dangerous assets. I spend my days auditing corporate logistics and finding corrupt vendors and surgically removing them from the company ecosystem before they can cause catastrophic financial losses. I opened the heavy binder and spread the contracts across my desk. I was no longer looking at a wedding celebration. I was looking at a hostile corporate takeover. I needed to execute a total asset liquidation immediately. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and a black pen. I started writing down the exact numbers associated with every single vendor. The luxury venue overlooking the lake was $30,000. The high-end catering company providing prime-aged steaks and imported truffles was $25,000. The boutique florist importing rare white orchids from overseas was $15,000. There were professional photographers and string quartets and custom lighting designers adding thousands more to the final bill. The total pending liability was absolutely staggering. I had already paid roughly $12,000 in non-refundable deposits over the past year. That money was completely gone forever. It was a sunk cost. In the business world, you never let a sunk cost cloud your logical judgment. You do not throw good money after bad money. Losing $12,000 hurt deeply, but it was the price of my absolute freedom. It was the penalty fee for ignoring the obvious red flags early in the relationship. It was a remarkably cheap price to pay to save myself from a lifetime of financial ruin and emotional abuse. The remaining balance across all vendors was exactly $82,400. I had to stop those payments from processing before the end of the week. I picked up my phone from the desk. My hands were completely steady. The panic and the adrenaline from the previous nights had burned away entirely, leaving nothing but absolute mental clarity. I dialed the number for the luxury venue first. The phone rang 3 times before the event coordinator answered. Her name was Sarah. She had a cheerful and highly professional voice. She immediately congratulated me on the upcoming day, assuming I was calling to confirm the final guest headcount. I took a deep, slow breath. I told her there would be no headcount. I told her the wedding was officially canceled. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Sarah stammered for a moment, clearly shocked by the sudden news. She asked if I was absolutely sure, mentioning that we were less than 3 weeks away from the scheduled date. She reminded me gently that the initial deposit was strictly non-refundable according to Section 4 of our signed agreement. I told her I was fully aware of the contract terms. I told her I did not want the deposit back under any circumstances. I just needed my name permanently removed from any future financial liability. I instructed her to send a formal cancellation agreement to my personal email address immediately. I told her to remove my credit card information from their digital billing system. Sarah asked if she needed to contact the bride to confirm the cancellation. My voice dropped an octave. I spoke with absolute corporate authority. I reminded her that my name and only my name was on the financial contract. I was the sole legal payee. Therefore, I was the only person authorized to make changes to the account. She agreed nervously. She promised the official paperwork would be in my inbox within the hour. I ended the call. One massive liability was successfully severed. The venue was gone forever. There was no longer a physical place for this wedding to happen. Next on my list was the premium catering company. This was the crowning achievement in the mind of my fiancée. She had insisted on hiring a local celebrity chef from a downtown restaurant to cater the reception. She wanted her arrogant country club friends to be overwhelmed by the sheer luxury of the evening menu. I dialed the number for the catering office. The general manager answered with a brisk and busy tone. I did not waste time with normal pleasantries. I stated my full name and my private account number. I told him to cancel the entire food order immediately. The manager became immediately defensive. He told me they had already ordered the premium aged beef and the specialty imported wines. He said they were preparing to begin the marinating process next week. He warned me loudly that breaking the contract this late would incur a 50% cancellation penalty on the remaining balance. I had already anticipated this exact response. I had read the fine print in his contract the night before. I calmly directed his attention to Clause 7, Paragraph B in his own legal document. The clause clearly stated that a client could cancel without a percentage penalty if they forfeited the initial massive deposit and provided notice at least 18 days prior to the event. Today was exactly 18 days before the wedding. We were right on the legal deadline. The manager shuffled papers loudly on his desk. He read the clause in total silence. He let out a frustrated sigh, realizing him on a technicality. He aggressively agreed to process the cancellation and close the account. I told him to email me the confirmation receipt. I hung up the phone. The food and the wine were officially gone. There would be no aged steaks. There would be no champagne toasts. The third call was to the boutique florist. Chloe and Brenda had spent hours designing massive floral arches and custom centerpieces and a trailing bouquet of rare white orchids. The final bill was absolutely outrageous. The owner of the flower shop answered the phone. She was an older woman who had been very sweet during our initial consultation. When I told her I needed to cancel the entire order, her voice softened with genuine pity. She asked if everything was all right. She asked if there had been a tragic family emergency. I told her that unfortunately the relationship had ended. I kept my explanation brief and highly professional. She was incredibly understanding. She told me she would keep the deposit to cover the cost of the flowers she had already sourced, but she would waive any further cancellation fees. She wished me the best of luck in the future. I thanked her and hung up the phone. The floral arrangements were gone. The reception hall, which no longer existed, would have no decorations. I spent the next 3 hours systematically dismantling every single piece of the wedding event. I called the high-end rental company and canceled the luxury linens and the gold-rimmed plates and the crystal glassware. I called the local entertainment agency and canceled the 10-piece string quartet and the live reception band. I called the luxury transportation service and canceled the vintage vehicle Chloe had demanded for our grand exit. With every phone call I made, another piece of the future Chloe was bragging about disappeared into thin air. I was erasing the event completely from existence. But the most important call I made was to my personal bank. I could not risk any of these vendors attempting to auto-draft the final payments despite my verbal cancellations. I spoke to a fraud specialist at my new banking institution. I reported my old corporate credit card as permanently lost and completely compromised. I had the account completely locked down and requested a new card with a new secure number to be issued immediately. I ensured that not a single dollar could be extracted from my accounts without my direct physical authorization. By 2 in the afternoon, the demolition operation was complete. I leaned back in my leather office chair and stared at the white ceiling. The silence in the house felt entirely different now. It was no longer the sad silence of an empty room. It was the dangerous silence of a loaded trap waiting to be sprung. I had successfully severed over $80,000 in pending financial liabilities. I had protected my hard-earned savings. I had protected my future. But the most surreal part of the entire situation was the absolute secrecy of what I had just done. The wedding no longer existed in the real world. There was no venue waiting to receive our wealthy guests. There was no celebrity chef preparing rich food. There were no flowers and no music and no chairs and no plates. The entire grand event had been completely erased from reality. But Chloe had absolutely no idea. Her manipulative mother had no idea. Her arrogant brother Trent had no idea. They were living in a completely fabricated reality. They were walking proudly on thin air, entirely unaware that I had quietly removed the solid ground from beneath their feet. The psychological weight of carrying this massive secret was immense. I knew I had to maintain the illusion for several more days. I had to let them continue their reckless spending. I had to let them boast and brag to their elite friends. The higher they climbed on their ladder of arrogance, the more devastating the final drop would be. I gathered all the cancellation receipts I had printed from my email. I placed them in a heavy manila envelope. I locked the envelope inside the bottom drawer of my desk. I took the thick, color-coded wedding planner binder and threw it directly into the trash can. I did not need it anymore. The future it represented was completely dead. Around 5 in the evening, I heard the heavy engine of the luxury vehicle Brenda drove pull into my driveway. The front door swung open a moment later. I heard the sharp sound of high heels clicking rapidly against the hardwood floor of the entryway. I heard the loud rustle of numerous paper shopping bags. Chloe and Brenda were laughing loudly together. They sounded completely victorious. They sounded like 2 women who had just successfully conquered the entire world and drained it of all its resources. I walked slowly down the stairs to greet them. The long hallway was filled with large, glossy shopping bags from the most expensive boutiques in the entire city. Chloe was holding a tall glass of expensive champagne she had poured the second she walked into the kitchen. Her face was flushed bright red with pure excitement and greed. She looked at me and held up a massive black garment bag. She told me she had found the perfect reception dress for the evening dancing. She casually mentioned that she had put the massive cost on her personal credit card, assuming my extensive funds would be available to clear the balance by the end of the week, just as they planned. Brenda was standing right behind her, inspecting my kitchen cabinets as if she was already planning exactly how to remodel them once she moved into my house permanently. Brenda looked at me and asked if I had picked up the dry cleaning as instructed. I told her I had picked it up. She nodded approvingly, treating me exactly like a hired servant who had adequately completed his assigned chores. Chloe took a large sip of her champagne and started talking rapidly about the wedding venue. She told her mother how beautiful the massive floral arches were going to look against the deep blue lake in the background. She talked about the imported aged steaks and how incredibly jealous her country club friends were going to be when they tasted the rare vintage wine. I stood there in the center of the kitchen, leaning casually against the cold granite counter, listening to every single word she said. She was describing a total ghost. She was passionately describing a venue she would never enter, and food she would never eat, and beautiful flowers she would never hold. She was painting a detailed picture of a magnificent, luxurious future that I had already completely destroyed hours ago. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I just smiled directly at her. It was the calmest and most genuine smile I had worn in several years. I told her it sounded like it was going to be a truly unforgettable day. I agreed with her mother that the guests were going to be absolutely shocked by the sheer elegance of the evening. They took my simple agreement as a sign of total submission. They smiled back at me, bathing happily in their own perceived glory. They had absolutely no idea that they were completely ruined. I was no longer a weak victim trapped in a toxic relationship. I was the silent architect of their total humiliation, and the rehearsal dinner was only a few short days away. The final week before the scheduled wedding arrived with a suffocating kind of energy. If you looked at my house from the outside, it seemed like a place preparing for a massive celebration. Delivery trucks pulled into the driveway every single morning. Expensive packages piled up in the front hallway. But inside my head, the house felt like a waiting room for a funeral. I was living in a bizarre alternate reality. I knew with absolute certainty that there was no venue, no caterer, and no florist. I had systematically dismantled every single piece of the event. But Chloe was completely oblivious. She floated through the rooms of my home with the manic, entitled energy of a queen who had just conquered a new kingdom. She truly believed that my silence over the past few days was proof that she had broken my spirit. She thought she had successfully trained me to be her silent financial backer. Every morning she would wake up early and start making demands. She treated the house like her own personal palace and treated me like a hired servant who was lucky to be allowed in her presence. She would sit at the kitchen island sipping premium coffee I had brewed for her and scroll through luxury vacation packages on her phone. She talked loudly about upgrading our honeymoon to a first-class suite in Greece, assuming my savings account would comfortably absorb the thousands of dollars in extra charges. I would stand by the sink washing her dishes and listen to her describe a future that was already entirely dead. The psychological restraint it took to nod and smile while she spent non-existent money was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. But Chloe was not even the worst part of that week. Her mother Brenda had essentially moved into my home. She arrived every day before noon, armed with a clipboard and a sense of absolute superiority. Brenda had taken it upon herself to supervise the final preparations, which mostly consisted of her sitting on my living room sofa and barking orders at me. She would point a manicured finger at the floor and tell me to vacuum the rugs because my house smelled like an old basement. She would demand that I run across town to pick up specialty ribbons for the wedding favors. When I brought them back, she would complain that I had chosen the wrong shade of white and call me incompetent. The most painful moments were when Brenda talked about my late father and his house. She walked through the rooms with a critical, disgusted look on her face, loudly planning the renovations she intended to make the second I was legally bound by that predatory prenuptial agreement. She stood in the kitchen I had spent 2 years renovating with my own hands and told Chloe that the cabinets looked cheap and blue-collar. She said the very first thing they would do with my money was tear down the wall separating the kitchen and the dining room to create an open concept space. She talked about hiring a high-end contractor to rip out the hardwood floors my father had laid down himself. Every insult felt like a physical blow to my chest. They were not just planning to steal my future, they were actively erasing my past. They wanted to destroy the only physical connection I had left to the man who raised me. I swallowed my pride. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. I nodded politely and told Brenda that her design ideas sounded very modern and sophisticated. I offered to fetch her a glass of sparkling water. I played the role of the defeated, obedient fool to absolute perfection because I knew that every arrogant comment she made was just another nail in her own coffin. Then came Trent. 2 days before the rehearsal dinner, Chloe's brother walked through my front door without knocking. He was wearing a sharp tailored suit and a pair of sunglasses he did not bother to take off indoors. He carried a glossy leather folder under his arm, looking like a man who had just closed $1 million deal. In reality, he was a broke day trader who was entirely dependent on my credit score to maintain his fake lifestyle. Trent threw the leather folder down onto the granite countertop of the kitchen island. It landed with a heavy, arrogant smack. He looked at me with a smirk that made my blood boil. He told me to open it. Inside were the finalized lease agreements for a brand new silver Porsche Macan. The monthly payments were astronomical. The required down payment was absurd. But Trent was not worried about the numbers because my name was printed boldly on the guarantor line. He tapped the paper with his index finger and told me he needed my corporate pay stubs and my tax returns printed and signed by Friday morning. He said the dealership was holding the car for him, and he wanted to drive it to the wedding reception to show off to his friends. Trent leaned across the counter, invading my personal space, and lowered his voice into a mocking whisper. He told me I was finally doing something useful with my boring corporate life. He said that a guy who just moves boxes for a living should be grateful to have a brother-in-law who knows how to handle real luxury. He called me box boy again, right to my face in my own kitchen. I told me to make sure the paperwork was pristine because he did not want my blue-collar stench ruining his new leather seats. The rage inside me was a towering inferno. I wanted to reach across the island, grab him by the collar of his expensive suit, and throw him straight out the front door. I wanted to tell him that I had already locked my credit, drained my accounts, and canceled the entire wedding. I wanted to watch his arrogant smirk shatter into a million pieces of pure panic. But my professional instincts held me back. As a supply chain director, I knew that prematurely exposing a trap allows the target to escape and minimize their losses. I needed Trent to be standing in a crowded room surrounded by his elite friends when the floor collapsed beneath him. So I took a slow, deep breath. I looked at the glossy brochure of the Porsche. I forced a look of submissive compliance onto my face. I told Trent I would have the financial documents printed and ready for him before the rehearsal dinner. He laughed loudly, patted me hard on the cheek like a patronizing parent, and walked out of the house. By Thursday evening, the tension in the house was at an absolute boiling point. I felt like a coiled spring ready to snap. It was the night of Chloe's bachelorette party. She had invited 15 of her wealthiest, most judgmental country club friends to a high-end downtown club for VIP bottle service. She had casually mentioned that morning that she was putting the entire night on her credit card, fully expecting my bank accounts to absorb the massive blow next week. She spent 3 hours getting ready, occupying the master bathroom, spraying expensive perfume and complaining that the lighting in my house was terrible for her makeup. When the black luxury SUV she had rented finally pulled up to the curb to take her away, she barely even looked at me. She just tossed her hair over her shoulder, told me not to wait up, and walked out the door. The moment the taillights of the SUV disappeared down the street, the atmosphere in the house shifted completely. The time for pretending was over. The execution phase had officially begun. I walked into the garage and pulled out 50 heavy-duty cardboard moving boxes I had quietly purchased and hidden behind my father's old workbench. I brought them inside and began the systematic process of erasing myself from the property. I started in the master bedroom. I opened my closet and packed every single suit, every expensive pair of shoes, and every piece of clothing I cared about. I left behind a few old t-shirts and a cheap suit just to make the closet look occupied at a quick glance, but everything of real value went into the boxes. Next, I moved to my home office. I packed up my computer, my external hard drives, and every single folder of important financial and legal documents. I cleared out the fireproof safe in the corner, taking my passport, my birth certificate, and the physical deed to the house. I was not going to leave a single piece of sensitive information anywhere near Chloe or Brenda. But the most important items I packed were the sentimental ones. I went through the living room and carefully wrapped my father's vintage collection of pocket watches. I packed the heavy wool quilt my grandmother had knitted. I took down the framed photographs of my family that meant the world to me. I was stripping the soul out of the house, leaving behind only the cold, hard shell of furniture and empty walls. I worked in absolute silence, moving with the precision and speed of a military operation. My heart was pounding, but my mind was completely clear. Every box I taped shut felt like a heavy chain being broken. Every item I carried out to my car felt like a victory. Over the next 4 hours, I made 3 separate trips in the dead of night to a highly secure climate-controlled storage facility on the other side of town. I unloaded my life into that metal unit, stacking the boxes neatly, locking my past and my future away behind a heavy steel door where Chloe and her family could never reach it. When I finally returned to the house after the 3rd trip, it was past 2 in the morning. I walked through the quiet rooms, inspecting my work. To an untrained eye, the house looked exactly the same. The heavy furniture was still there. The television was on the wall. Chloe's massive pile of shopping bags still cluttered the hallway. But the house was entirely hollow. My valuables were gone. My documents were secure. My money was locked away in a new bank. I had successfully and completely insulated myself from their incoming attack. I took a quick shower to wash off the sweat and the dust from moving the boxes. I lay down on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the central air conditioning. I did not sleep. The adrenaline rushing through my veins made it impossible to close my eyes. I lay there waiting for the sun to come up, waiting for the final day of this miserable charade to begin. Around 4 a.m, the front door rattled open. I heard Chloe stumbling into the hallway, giggling loudly while talking on her phone to one of her friends. She kicked off her heels, letting them clatter against the hardwood floor. She walked into the bedroom, completely ignoring the fact that I was lying there in the dark. She smelled like expensive vodka and poor decisions. She did not bother to wash her face or brush her teeth. She just collapsed onto the bed beside me, pulling the heavy duvet over her shoulders, and passed out almost immediately. I turned my head and looked at her in the dim light of the street lamp filtering through the blinds. She looked so peaceful, so entirely confident in her victory. She was dreaming about her luxury condo, her massive wedding reception, and the hundreds of thousands of dollars she thought she had successfully stolen from me. She had no idea that the man lying next to her was no longer her victim. She had no idea that the ground she was sleeping on had already been completely hollowed out. When Friday morning finally arrived, the house buzzed with a chaotic, nervous energy. Today was the day of the rehearsal dinner. Brenda arrived bright and early, bringing bagels and coffee, acting like a triumphant general preparing for a victory parade. She and Chloe sat at the kitchen island going over the seating chart for a reception hall that had canceled our reservation 5 days ago. They discussed the floral arrangements that were never going to arrive. They talked about the celebrity chef who was currently booking other clients. It was the most surreal, bizarre theater I had ever witnessed. They were living in a complete fantasy, and they were dragging me along as a silent prop in their delusion. I walked into the kitchen wearing a clean button-down shirt and poured myself a cup of black coffee. Brenda stopped talking and looked at me. She smiled, but it was a cold, predatory smile. She asked me if I was ready for the big night. She specifically asked if I remembered to bring the prenuptial agreement from Robert Sterling's office. She wanted to make sure I was going to sign my financial life away in front of all their wealthy friends, just as I had promised. I looked directly into Brenda's eyes. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, hiding the massive wave of anticipation that was currently crashing against my ribs. I told her I had the document right here in my briefcase. I told her I was looking forward to making everything official tonight. Chloe beamed with absolute delight. She walked over, wrapped her arms around my waist, and rested her head against my chest. She told me I was going to make her the happiest bride in the world. She said she could not wait to show everyone what a strong, supportive husband I was going to be. The sheer hypocrisy of her words made my skin crawl, but I did not pull away. I gently patted her on the back. The tension in the house was no longer just a feeling. It was a physical weight pressing down on the air. Every tick of the clock brought us closer to the explosion. They had spent the entire week insulting my career, mocking my father's house, and spending my phantom money. They had pushed me into a corner, expecting me to cower and surrender. They thought I was a pathetic blue-collar box boy who lacked the killer instinct to protect himself. I finished my coffee and set the empty ceramic mug on the granite counter. I looked at the glossy Porsche brochure Trent had left behind. I looked at the massive pile of luxury shopping bags Chloe had accumulated. I looked at Brenda, who was already measuring my windows for new curtains. The illusion of their grandeur was absolutely perfect. It was a massive, towering glass castle built entirely on lies, manipulation, and my stolen credit. And as I walked out of the kitchen to get dressed for the rehearsal dinner, I knew with absolute cold certainty that I was about to shatter that glass castle into a million pieces. The time for hiding was over. The demolition was about to go public. The drive to the restaurant felt like moving through a vacuum. The streets of the city blurred past my windows, but my mind was perfectly still. I pulled up to the valet stand of the most exclusive steakhouse in the downtown district. The building was a massive structure of glass and dark stone, projecting an aura of heavy, intimidating wealth. The valet opened my door with a practiced smile, and I stepped out into the freezing evening air. I handed him my keys and adjusted the cuffs of my suit. My chest was rising and falling with a slow and steady rhythm. The panic that had choked me a week ago was completely gone. I walked through the heavy revolving doors and stepped into the warm, dimly lit lobby. The hostess greeted me and led me past the crowded main dining room toward the private event suites in the back. The sound of clinking crystal and low murmurs grew louder with every step. My heart beat a heavy, calm drum against my ribs. I was walking into the lion's den, but I was the only one who knew the teeth had been removed. The hostess pushed open the double oak doors to the private room, and a wave of sound washed over me. There were exactly 50 people in the room. They were Chloe and Brenda and their most elite inner circle. The room smelled of expensive imported perfumes, roasted garlic, and vintage wine. Women in designer cocktail dresses clustered around the open bar, laughing with their heads thrown back. Men in tailored suits stood in tight circles, holding low-ball glasses of scotch and discussing stock portfolios. It was a sea of absolute snobbery. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching them. They looked so secure in their artificial world. They believed they were the untouchable upper class, and I was just the blue-collar outsider lucky enough to be invited to the feast. Brenda was the first to spot me. She was wearing a dark velvet dress and a string of pearls that she had probably bought on credit. She marched across the room holding a glass of champagne with a smug, victorious smile plastered across her face. She grabbed my arm and dragged me toward a group of her country club friends. She introduced me loudly, making sure everyone knew I was the man who was going to finance her daughter and her perfect life. Her friends looked me up and down with barely concealed pity. One of them asked what I did for a living with a tone that suggested she expected me to say I dug ditches. I kept my expression perfectly neutral. I told them I managed supply chains. They smiled politely and quickly turned the conversation back to the upcoming wedding in Greece. I stood there listening to them debate the merits of first class versus private charter flights. They were debating the travel logistics for a wedding that had been legally completely erased from existence. I just nodded and smiled, taking a slow sip of my water. Chloe drifted over to me a few minutes later. She looked like a runway model in a stunning white evening gown. She slipped her arm through mine and leaned her head against my shoulder, playing the role of the deeply in love bride for the audience of her wealthy peers. She smelled like expensive jasmine and cold calculation. She did not ask how my day was. She did not ask how I was feeling. She simply whispered in my ear that the lawyers had dropped off the final paperwork and that I needed to be ready to sign it when the time came. I looked down at her beautiful face and gave her a warm, reassuring smile. I told her I was absolutely ready. Her eyes lit up with triumph. She genuinely believed she had conquered my spirit completely. She fluttered away to greet another group of arriving guests, leaving me standing alone near the back wall. I watched Trent enter the room a few moments later. He arrived late intentionally to make a grand entrance. He was wearing a silver suit that matched the color of the Porsche he thought he was leasing on my credit. He walked in like he owned the entire building. He high-fived a few of his day-trading friends and immediately ordered the most expensive scotch at the bar. He saw me standing by the wall and gave me a mocking little salute with his glass. He was brimming with absolute arrogance. I thought I was nothing more than a pathetic stepping stone for his family. I simply raised my glass of water in return, acknowledging his salute with total inner peace. He had no idea that his entire financial future was currently built on quicksand. The event coordinator rang a small silver bell and asked everyone to take their seats for the dinner service. The tables were covered in heavy white linen and decorated with tall, elegant centerpieces. I was seated at the head table directly next to Chloe. Brenda sat on her other side and Trent sat directly across from me. The waiters moved silently around the room, pouring expensive wine and serving the first course of seared scallops and caviar. The conversation at the table was a continuous stream of vanity. Brenda talked loudly about the kitchen renovations she was planning for my father and his house. She described the exact shade of imported marble she was going to use for the countertops. Trent bragged to the woman sitting next to him about his upcoming vehicle delivery detailing the horsepower and the custom leather interior. Chloe chimed in to describe the massive floral arches that were supposedly being built for the ceremony on Saturday. I sat in the center of their delusions, eating my food in absolute silence. It was the most surreal experience of my entire life. I was surrounded by 50 people who were celebrating a reality that did not exist. I looked at the expensive food on my plate. I looked at the crystal wine glasses catching the dim light of the chandeliers. I knew that the bill for this single dinner was going to be astronomical, and I knew exactly who they expected to pay for it. I let them talk. I let them build their glass castle higher and higher into the sky. Every arrogant comment Trent made was another brick. Every entitled demand Brenda voiced was another pane of glass. I was going to let them finish building it before I brought the entire structure crashing down on their heads. The dinner service lasted for 2 agonizing hours. The waiters cleared the main course plates and brought out trays of artisan desserts and fresh espresso. The room grew warm, and the noise level reached a dull roar as the guests grew intoxicated on the free-flowing wine. Then the moment arrived. Trent stood up from his chair. He picked up a silver spoon and tapped it repeatedly against the side of his crystal glass. The sharp clinking sound cut through the loud chatter of the room. The guests slowly stopped talking and turned their attention toward the head table. Trent waited until the room was completely silent before he lowered the spoon. He buttoned his silver suit jacket and picked up his glass of scotch. He looked out at the crowd with a wide, charismatic smile, but his eyes were entirely cold when they shifted to me. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Trent began, his voice projecting loudly across the private suite. "We are gathered here to celebrate my beautiful sister Chloe and her upcoming marriage." The crowd offered a warm, polite round of applause. Trent waited for it to die down before he continued. "You know, growing up in our family, we were always taught that success is not just about what you have. It is about who you surround yourself with. It is about winning. We are a family of winners. We understand what it takes to elevate ourselves and maintain a certain standard of living." He paused and took a slow, dramatic sip of his scotch. He turned his body slightly so he was facing me directly. The 50 guests shifted their gaze from Trent to me. I sat perfectly still, resting my hands on the white linen tablecloth. And then there is Garrett Trent, said, his tone dripping with condescending pity. Garrett comes from a very different background. He works in a warehouse. He moves boxes. He lives a simple blue-collar life. When Chloe first brought him home, we were honestly a little concerned. We wondered if a guy who punches a clock could really step up and provide the kind of life a woman like my sister requires. A few of the guests chuckled softly into their wine glasses. Brenda beamed with pride, nodding along with her son and his insulting speech. Chloe looked down at her hands, feigning a look of modest humility. I did not break eye contact with Trent. I let him dig the hole as deep as he possibly could. "But Garrett has surprised us." Trent continued, raising his voice slightly to command the room. "He has realized that joining this family means stepping up to the plate. It means leaving behind his small thinking and embracing the obligations of a real provider. He has shown us that he is willing to do whatever it takes to support my sister and my mother and our legacy. So I want to be the first to officially welcome you, Garrett. Welcome to a real family of winners. Try to keep up." Trent raised his glass high in the air. The 50 guests raised their glasses in unison. "Hear, hear," they murmured, echoing his toast. Trent drank the rest of his scotch and slammed the glass down on the table with a triumphant thud. He looked at me with a smirk that was so utterly arrogant it made my blood run cold. He thought he had just delivered the ultimate public humiliation. He thought he had established absolute dominance over me in front of their entire social circle. He sat back down, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for me to lower my head in submission. The applause faded and a heavy, expectant silence settled over the head table. This was the cue. Chloe stood up from her chair. She smoothed down the front of her white designer gown, ensuring every eye in the room was fixed directly on her. She reached under the table and pulled out a thick premium leather folder. It was the exact same folder Robert Sterling had promised to prepare for us at the law office. The gold-embossed logo of his firm caught the light of the chandelier. Chloe walked slowly around the back of my chair and stood beside me. She placed the heavy leather folder directly onto the white tablecloth in front of me. She opened the cover, revealing the thick stack of legal documents inside. The predatory prenuptial agreement was printed on high-quality paper. The signature lines at the bottom of the final page were marked with small red flags. The document that would legally transfer all of her hidden credit card debt into my name was waiting. The clause that would grant Brenda the right to live in my late father and his house rent-free was bolded. It was the physical manifestation of their entire financial heist, sitting right there in front of 50 wealthy witnesses. Chloe reached into the neckline of her dress and pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen. She bent down close to me, pressing her cheek against mine. She smelled strongly of jasmine and victory. She placed the heavy silver pen directly on top of the legal document. She looked out at the silent crowd, her eyes wide and shining with manufactured tears of joy. She looked like the perfect vulnerable bride asking her strong provider for protection. She turned her head and looked me dead in the eyes. Her voice was soft, but it carried perfectly across the quiet room. "Show them you are a real husband, Garrett." The 50 guests leaned forward in their chairs. Brenda leaned across the table, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. Trent smirked, watching my hands, expecting me to pick up the pen and sign my financial execution order. They had completely cornered me. They had built a perfect, inescapable public trap. They expected me to break under the pressure of their collective judgment. They expected me to surrender my future just to avoid embarrassing them in front of their elite friends. They expected me to be the silent, obedient wallet they had designed me to be. I looked down at the silver pen resting on the crisp white paper. I looked at the red flags pointing to the signature line. I felt the slow, steady rhythm of my own heart. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents above us. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the heavy, perfumed air of the private suite. I did not reach for the pen. I reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents above us. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the heavy, perfumed air of the private suite. I did not reach for the silver fountain pen resting on the crisp white paper. I did not look at the predatory legal document that was designed to completely destroy my financial future. Instead, I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket. My fingers brushed against the smooth, heavy paper of the 3 manila envelopes I had prepared earlier that afternoon. I pulled them out slowly, laying them flat on the white tablecloth right next to the prenuptial agreement. The 50 wealthy guests watched me in total silence. They expected me to sign away my life and submit to their elite hierarchy, but instead I was handing out reading material. I slid the first envelope across the table toward Chloe. I slid the second one toward Brenda. I pushed the third one directly across the center of the table toward Trent. "What is this, Garrett?" Chloe asked, her voice losing a fraction of its manufactured sweetness. She looked down at the blank envelope resting in front of her, and then back up at me with a flicker of genuine confusion in her eyes. She was waiting for me to play my assigned role of the obedient broken man, but I was going completely off script. "Consider it my wedding gift to the family," I replied, my voice completely steady and loud enough for the entire room to hear. Brenda frowned heavily, her thick premium makeup creasing around her eyes as she picked up her envelope with visible suspicion. Trent let out a short, arrogant scoff. He did not bother opening his yet. He just leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms over his silver suit jacket, looking at me like I was a peasant wasting his highly valuable time. I stood up from my chair. I did not look at them anymore. I turned my back on the head table and walked slowly toward the large flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of the private dining room. The restaurant used it for high-end corporate presentations and digital slideshows. Earlier in the evening, Chloe had loudly mentioned that her bridesmaids had prepared a romantic photo montage of our relationship. The long connection cable was already resting on the small media cart beneath the screen. I pulled my phone from my pocket and plugged the cable directly into the charging port. The massive television screen flickered to life. The restaurant chatter had completely died down. 50 elite guests sat frozen in their seats, holding their crystal wine glasses, waiting to see a beautiful slideshow of a happy, wealthy couple. Instead, the huge screen illuminated the dark private room with a stark white background and lines of bold black text. It was the digital note I had found on the shared home tablet 3 days ago. The bold heading at the very top of the screen was blown up to massive proportions. It read, "Wedding and Mom's Upgrades." I walked back to the center of the room and picked up the small wireless microphone the event coordinator had left on the wooden podium for evening toasts. I tapped the metal mesh once to ensure it was active. The sharp sound echoed through the quiet room, demanding absolute attention. Chloe dropped her envelope onto the table. Her face went completely pale. All the blood drained from her cheeks in a single terrifying second. She recognized her own digital handwriting immediately. Her perfect, confident posture collapsed as she stared at the screen in absolute horror. For the past week, I have been listening to this family talk about what it means to be a real provider, I said, speaking calmly and directly into the microphone. My voice carried a heavy, absolute authority that I had never used in front of them before. Trent told you all tonight that I am just a box boy who does not understand the standard of living his sister requires. Brenda told me that a real man elevates his wife and her family without asking questions. And Chloe told me I was entirely selfish for refusing to hand over an unlimited corporate credit card. I paused, letting the words hang in the heavy air. The wealthy guests looked extremely uncomfortable. Some of them shifted nervously in their expensive seats. A few men in the back row lowered their drinks, staring intently at the massive screen, trying to read the text. But true wealth is not about what you demand from others. I continued pacing slowly across the front of the room. It is about what you build yourself. And what this family has built is a towering mountain of toxic debt and calculated financial fraud. "Garrett, stop it right now!" Chloe hissed, standing up rapidly from her chair. Her voice was shaking with pure, unfiltered panic. She reached out toward me as if she could physically grab the words out of the air, but I simply took a step back, keeping my distance. I pressed a button on my phone. The screen behind me changed. It zoomed in on the specific section of her digital note, highlighting the exact sum of $45,000 next to a plan to drain my personal savings account. "Chloe has been telling all of you that she is completely debt-free," I announced, looking out at her elite friends sitting at the closest tables. "She judges people who carry balances on their credit cards. But the reality is that she has secretly racked up $45,000 in high-interest debt, buying designer clothes and taking luxury vacations just to impress all of you. Her master plan, as written right there on the screen, was to electronically wire the funds from my emergency savings account tomorrow morning while I was getting ready with my groomsmen. She was going to wipe her slate clean using the money I worked 60-hour weeks to save. And the prenuptial agreement she just handed me to sign was legally designed to ensure I inherited that massive debt permanently if she ever decided to leave me." The room erupted in loud, shocked whispers. Several women at the table closest to the screen gasped, covering their mouths with their hands. Chloe stood frozen, staring out at her peers with eyes wide with absolute humiliation. Her perfect, wealthy facade was cracking right in front of her elite audience, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I pressed the button on my phone again. The image on the television shifted to a scanned copy of a mortgage pre-approval application. The name at the top was mine, but the intended property was a luxury condominium complex downtown. "Brenda," I said, turning my attention to my future mother-in-law. Brenda was staring at the screen with her mouth hanging open, completely speechless. "You wanted to make sure your daughter was taken care of. But you also wanted to make sure you got a brand new luxury condo out of the deal. You used my social security number without my consent to apply for a massive mortgage loan. You planned to use my flawless credit to secure the property and then legally transfer the deed into your name so you could live rent-free on my dime." "That is a lie!" Brenda shrieked, finally finding her voice. Her face turned a furious shade of purple and she pointed a shaking finger at me. "He is lying to all of you. He hacked into our private accounts. This is a complete fabrication." "Open your envelope, Brenda," I said calmly, keeping the microphone steady. She did not move. Her hands were shaking too violently to open the paper flap. so the man sitting directly next to her, a prominent local real estate developer, reached over and opened it for her. He pulled out the printed copies of the hard credit inquiries from the major credit bureaus. He looked at the official paperwork and then looked at Brenda with absolute visible disgust. "It is all right there," I told the quiet crowd. "Time-stamped and documented. 3 hard credit inquiries made using my stolen identity in the last 4 days." I pressed the button one final time. The screen flashed to a copy of a luxury auto lease agreement for a brand new silver Porsche Macan. I turned to look at Trent. He was no longer leaning back arrogantly in his chair. He was sitting bolt upright, gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. "Trent likes to talk about being a winner," I said, staring directly into his panicked eyes. "He likes to mock my career and my blue-collar roots. He drove here tonight expecting to finalize a lease on a sports car he cannot actually afford. He expected to use my corporate income statements to bypass the strict dealership credit check because his own financial portfolio is completely underwater. He is a day trader who is currently drowning in bad margin calls and toxic investments. I is completely broke." "Shut your mouth, box boy!" Trent shouted, jumping up from his chair so fast it tipped over backwards. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face contorted with absolute rage. "You do not know anything about my finances. You are just a pathetic warehouse worker trying to embarrass your betters." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The evidence was towering over him on the massive screen, illuminating his complete failure for everyone to see. "If you are so incredibly wealthy, Trent, why is my name listed as the primary financial guarantor on your new car?" I asked simply. Trent opened his mouth to shout another insult, but nothing came out. He looked desperately around the room at his wealthy friends. They were staring at him with a mixture of pity and severe judgment. In their elite circles, there was nothing more embarrassing than pretending to have money when you were actually destitute. Trent slowly sank down, closing his eyes, totally defeated by his own brutal public exposure. The private room was consumed by a heavy, suffocating silence. The 50 guests who had been drinking expensive wine and laughing at my expense just 10 minutes ago were now completely paralyzed. They had come to celebrate a high society wedding, and instead they were witnessing a brutal forensic accounting of a fraudulent family. Chloe was openly weeping now. Real tears streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup and staining the collar of her white designer gown. She took a step toward me, holding her hands out in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Garrett, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking violently in the quiet room. "Please turn the screen off. We can talk about this in private. We can fix this. I love you. Do not do this to us in front of everyone." I looked at her. I saw the woman I had spent 3 years loving, supporting, and trusting. I saw the woman who had coldly calculated exactly how to destroy my life, drain my savings, and steal my father and his legacy. There was no pity left in my heart. There was only the cold, hard clarity of justice. "You do not love me, Chloe," I said softly but clearly through the microphone. "You love what I can buy for you. You love the financial safety net I provide for your family and their endless delusions of grandeur. You thought I was weak. You thought I was so desperate for your validation that I would blindly walk right into a trap. But you forgot that I manage supply chains for a living. I identify toxic liabilities and I cut them off permanently before they can bankrupt the entire company." I placed the wireless microphone carefully back onto the wooden podium. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my car keys. The weight of the moment felt absolutely incredible. I was shedding a massive, crushing burden that I had been carrying silently for an entire week. I turned to face the entire room one last time. By the way, I said, raising my natural voice slightly so it carried to the very back tables. "You all look really great tonight in your tailored suits and your expensive designer gowns. But you might want to make other plans for tomorrow afternoon." Chloe stopped crying and stared at me, a look of total, absolute confusion washing over her face. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, wiping a dark streak of makeup from her cheek. I looked directly into her eyes and delivered the ultimate devastating drop. "I canceled the luxury venue," I said flatly. I canceled the celebrity chef and the premium catering. I canceled the boutique florist and the string quartet and the vintage getaway car. I made the phone calls 4 days ago while you were out shopping. The initial deposits are gone, but the remaining $80,000 you expected me to pay will never be drafted from my accounts. Brenda let out a loud, horrific gasp, clutching her pearl necklace as if she had just been physically struck. Trent dropped his face into his hands, rubbing his temples in pure agony, realizing the depths of their failure. There is no venue. I continued, my voice echoing with absolute finality. There is no food. There are no flowers. I took a slow, deliberate step backward toward the heavy oak doors of the private suite. I looked at the three of them sitting at the head table, completely shattered and exposed in front of their entire social circle. The glass castle they had built on my stolen credit had completely collapsed right on top of them. There is no wedding, I said. I turned around and pushed the heavy double doors open, walking out into the quiet, carpeted hallway of the restaurant. I did not look back to see the chaos that immediately erupted in the private room behind me. I did not care. I walked past the hostess stand, past the crowded main dining area, and out into the freezing city air. I handed my ticket to the valet and waited for my car, breathing in the cold, clean night, feeling entirely, completely free. The heavy oak doors of the private dining suite shut firmly behind me, sealing the chaos inside the room. I stood in the quiet, carpeted hallway of the restaurant for a long moment, just listening to the muffled sounds of the explosion I had just detonated. It sounded like a bomb had gone off in a glass factory. I could hear Chloe screaming my name, her voice high and desperate, lacking all of the entitled arrogance she had carried for the past 3 years. I could hear Brenda sobbing loudly, her theatrical cries echoing through the thick wooden doors as she tried to explain the forged loan applications to the stunned crowd of high society guests. I did not turn around. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or pity. I just buttoned my suit jacket, took a deep breath of the quiet air, and walked down the long corridor toward the main lobby. The knot in my chest that had been suffocating me for weeks was completely gone. I handed my ticket to the valet outside and tipped him generously. I got into my car and drove away into the freezing city night, leaving the ruins of their toxic empire in my rearview mirror forever. The social fallout was immediate and absolutely brutal. Chloe and her mother had built their entire identities on the illusion of superior wealth and social status. They had invited 50 of the most elite, judgmental people in their circle to that rehearsal dinner specifically to show off. But high society circles are incredibly unforgiving when it comes to financial fraud. By the time I reached my house that night, my phone was already receiving frantic text messages from Chloe. She begged me to come back. She promised she would change. She said we could go to counseling and fix everything. I did not reply. I blocked her number. I blocked Brenda. I blocked Trent. I later learned from a mutual acquaintance that their wealthy friends had walked out of the restaurant in absolute disgust. They did not want to be associated with identity theft or toxic debt. Chloe was instantly exiled from her country club circle. The women she had spent months bragging to completely cut her off, ignoring her calls and deleting her from their social media accounts. She was left entirely alone with the devastating reality of what she had done. But the social humiliation was only the beginning of their punishment. The real justice arrived the very next morning with a tidal wave of legal consequences. Because I had officially and legally canceled the massive wedding contracts 4 days prior, my financial liability was completely severed. However, Chloe and Brenda had been so blinded by their own greed that they had made a fatal mistake during their planning process. Whenever they demanded premium upgrades like the imported white orchids or the rare vintage champagne, the vendors had required a secondary signature to authorize the additional luxury charges. Chloe and Brenda had eagerly signed those authorization forms themselves, assuming my bank accounts would automatically cover the final balances. When the vendors woke up on the morning of the supposed wedding, they immediately went after the 2 women who had signed for the goods. The luxury venue, the celebrity chef, and the boutique florist all filed aggressive breach of contract claims against Chloe and Brenda, because the goods had already been sourced and the event dates had been completely blocked out. The cancellation penalties were absolute. They were suddenly buried under exactly $82,400 of non-refundable debt. The boutique vendors were relentless. They hired collection agencies and threatened severe legal action. Chloe had no savings, and her credit cards were already maxed out from her secret shopping sprees. Brenda could not help her because her own financial history was a complete disaster. The luxury condominium she had tried to steal using my social security number was immediately denied when the mortgage brokers realized the application was entirely fraudulent. They had tried to drain my life savings to fund their delusions, and instead they had legally locked themselves into a massive financial prison of their own making. While Chloe and Brenda were drowning in vendor debt, Trent was facing his own spectacular downfall. The arrogant day trader who had mocked my blue-collar career and called me a pathetic box boy had his entire fake reality shattered that same week. Trent had built his flashy lifestyle entirely on high-risk margin trading, assuming the stock market would always bend in his favor. But the market is ruthless. A massive economic shift caused his highly leveraged tech investments to plummet over the course of 3 days. Because he had no actual liquid capital, his brokerage firm issued a brutal margin call. They liquidated his entire portfolio at a massive loss, wiping out every single dollar he had to his name. Trent tried to save his image by driving to the luxury auto dealership to finalize the lease on his new silver Porsche Macan. He thought he could at least maintain the appearance of wealth. But because I had locked down my credit and publicly exposed his financial instability at the rehearsal dinner, the dealership ran a standard verification check. They immediately saw that his application was entirely fraudulent. They completely rejected his lease and banned him from the showroom. Within 2 weeks, Trent was completely broke. He could no longer afford the exorbitant rent on his downtown luxury loft. The man who wore tailored Italian suits and drank vintage scotch was formally evicted from his building. With absolutely nowhere else to go, Trent was forced to pack his designer clothes into cheap cardboard boxes and move into his mother and her extremely cramped 2-bedroom apartment. The three of them, Chloe, Brenda, and Trent, were now trapped together in that tiny space, suffocating under a mountain of debt and the bitter realization that they had destroyed their own lives. I did not attend the wedding that Saturday. Instead, I spent the morning driving back to the secure climate-controlled storage facility on the edge of town. I unlocked the heavy metal door and began loading the cardboard boxes containing my life back into my vehicle. I drove back to the house my late father had built, the house that Brenda had insulted and tried to steal. I spent the entire weekend slowly unpacking my belongings, placing everything exactly where it belonged. I hung the framed family photographs back on the walls. I arranged my father and his vintage pocket watches on the mantel. I put the thick wool quilt my grandmother had knitted back onto my bed. The house was no longer hollow. It was entirely secure, and it was completely mine. On Sunday evening, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and walked out onto the front porch. The neighborhood was quiet, and the setting sun cast a warm golden light across the wooden floorboards. I sat down in my father and his old rocking chair, resting my hands on the wooden armrests. I took a slow sip of the hot coffee and listened to the peaceful sound of the wind moving through the large oak trees in the front yard. For the past 3 years, I had lived in a constant state of anxiety, walking on eggshells, trying to appease a family that viewed me as nothing more than a financial resource. I had swallowed my pride and accepted their insults because I thought that was what a good partner was supposed to do. I had believed their twisted definition of what it meant to be a real man. Sitting there in the quiet evening, I realized how incredibly wrong I had been. True wealth has absolutely nothing to do with unlimited corporate credit cards, luxury vehicles, or high society approval. True wealth is not measured by how much money you can spend to elevate toxic people who do not respect you. It is not about being a walking automated teller machine for emotional parasites who drain your energy and insult your character. True wealth is found in self-respect. It is found in the quiet confidence of knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. It is the ability to look a manipulator directly in the eyes and firmly say no without feeling a single shred of guilt. It is the courage to build an unbreakable boundary around your life and fiercely protect the things you have worked hard to earn. My father had worked construction for 40 years to pay off the mortgage on this house. He had bled for this property, and he had left it to me because he trusted me to build a solid foundation for my own future. Chloe and her family had looked at this house and seen nothing but a blue-collar dump to be exploited and demolished. But they were the ones who ended up living in the wreckage of their own greed. I had walked into that upscale restaurant as a man. They believed they had completely conquered, and I had walked out as the architect of my own freedom. The long game is not about screaming for revenge or stooping to their level of cruelty. It is about quietly removing the financial and emotional floorboards they are standing on and letting gravity do the rest of the work. I took another sip of my coffee, watching the first stars appear in the evening sky. The air felt incredibly clean. The future felt wide open. I was no longer an emotional hostage. I was no longer a victim. I was a man who had successfully audited his own life, identified the worst possible liabilities, and cut them off permanently before they could destroy everything I had built. The peace I felt in that moment was worth far more than any wedding or any toxic relationship. It was the peace of a man who had finally learned his own true value. If you have ever had to cut a toxic leech out of your life to save your own future, hit that like button. Drop a comment below and tell me exactly how you set your boundaries and took your power back from the people who tried to use you. Subscribe for more stories about truth, respect, and always playing the long game.